Have you ever walked into a place where you were supposed to be respected, only to be treated as if you didn't belong? Imagine carrying a check worth over $2 million money you worked for, money that was rightfully yours, only to watch a bank manager set it on fire in front of a crowd. Not because the check was fake, not because you had done anything wrong, but because of the color of your skin, the way you looked, or the assumptions made about you. Now pause for a moment. If that had been you humiliated in public, stripped of dignity in seconds, what would you have done? Would you have walked away quietly, swallowing the pain, or would you have stood tall, knowing the truth of who you are, and forced the world to see it too? This is not just a story about a check. It's about choices, dignity, and the price of assumptions. And once you hear what happened next, you'll never forget it. So before we begin this journey, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a mirror. And maybe it's yours too. The morning began like any other at Riverside First Bank, the downtown branch in Cleveland. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and strong coffee drifting from the break room. The marble floor reflected the sunlight that streamed in through tall windows, making the whole lobby look like a place of order and stability. The bank had built its reputation on tradition, on rules written decades ago, and on the unspoken belief that only certain kinds of people truly belonged there. At 2:40 p.m., the doors swung open, and Anthony Cole walked in. He looked ordinary to anyone who glanced at him. A black man in his early 40s, dressed in a plain navy jacket, gray slacks, and a pair of scuffed brown shoes. He carried no entourage, no signs of power. In his right hand, he held a plain envelope. Inside it rested a single check worth $2,415,000. Anthony did not look nervous. He had a calmness about him, the kind that comes from years of storms weathered. But there was a weight in his eyes, a stillness that suggested he had been here before, maybe not in this exact building, but in this moment of being underestimated. Behind the front desk stood Harold Denton, the branch manager. His shirt was starched, his tie knotted tight, his hair combed back in a style that seemed to belong to another decade. Harold had been with the bank for over 20 years. He wore his position like armor, and when he saw Anthony approaching, his smile did not reach his eyes. "Good afternoon," Anthony said softly. He slid the envelope across the desk. "I need to deposit this check into my account." Harold picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. He unfolded the paper slowly, reading the numbers once, then again, his lips tightening into a smirk. "This," Harold said, tapping the check, "is some kind of mistake." Anthony kept his tone even. "It's not a mistake. The account is under my name. Everything is in order." But Harold was already shaking his head. "Men like you don't walk in here with a check like this. You're trying to pull something." He chuckled, loud enough for the customers waiting in line to hear. "What is this? Some welfare scam?" The words cut through the air like a blade. A couple near the door glanced up. A young man in line pulled out his phone and began recording. But no one spoke up. Anthony inhaled, then exhaled, slowly. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Never let them take your dignity. Stand tall, even in silence." "I assure you," Anthony said, "this is legitimate." Harold leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You people always think you can play games with the system. Not in my branch." He reached into the drawer beneath the counter, pulled out a silver lighter, and before anyone could stop him, flicked it open. A small flame hissed to life, With a smile that looked more like triumph than caution, he touched the flame to the corner of the check. The paper curled black, the ink blistered, and in seconds, the check was reduced to ash. The smell of burning filled the lobby. Gas rippled through the room. A woman covered her mouth with both hands. The young man's camera phone captured every second. Anthony stood still. His eyes followed the ash drifting upward like black snowflakes. He said nothing. He didn't reach across the desk. He didn't shout. His silence was louder than any scream could have been. Harold slammed the lighter shut and dusted his hands, as though he had cleansed the bank of something dirty. "There," he said. "Problem solved. No fraud today." The clock on the wall ticked to 2:47 p. The whole lobby seemed to hold its breath. The shock was immediate. Customers whispered. Some laughed nervously. A mother tugged her child closer, as if trouble was about to erupt. But Anthony did not move. His stillness unnerved Harold, who had expected outrage, a scene, maybe even a fight. Instead, Anthony simply stood with his hands folded in front of him, his gaze steady, his breathing calm. And in that stillness, something began to shift. The balance of power was not where Harold thought it was, not yet visible, but waiting. The ashes on the desk glowed faintly before fading into dust. And somewhere inside Anthony's jacket pocket, his phone buzzed once, a quiet reminder of the time. 3:00 was coming. The ashes had barely settled on the polished counter when a wave of murmurs swept through the lobby. The smell of burnt paper lingered, sharp and bitter, making the place feel less like a bank and more like a crime scene. A mother in a red coat pulled her son closer and whispered something in his ear. A man in a suit adjusted his tie, pretending not to watch, though his eyes never left Anthony. The young man with the phone camera kept recording, angling for a better shot. Each second stretched, heavy with tension, as if everyone in the room was waiting for Anthony to explode. But he didn't. Anthony Cole remained where he was, shoulders straight, face calm. His silence unsettled the onlookers more than any outburst could have. People shifted their weight, coughed, or stared at the floor. Some looked at Harold Denton with approval, others with doubt, but no one spoke aloud. Harold seemed to grow taller in that silence. He adjusted his tie with satisfaction, mistaking Anthony's composure for weakness. He turned toward the customers, raising his voice like an actor on stage. "You all saw that, didn't you?" he said. "Fraud right here, in broad daylight. I don't tolerate it in my branch." A few customers nodded faintly, not because they agreed, but because they feared being pulled into the spotlight. The young man with the phone muttered under his breath, "Fraud. He didn't even check the system." His voice was swallowed by the low hum of the lobby. Anthony's gaze drifted to the clock again. 2:50 p.m. 10 minutes to go. The crowd was restless. An older woman clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles pale. A teenager in a hoodie whispered to his friend, "That guy's crazy, burning a check like that." They snickered, nervous, their laughter bouncing awkwardly against the marble walls. A man at the back cleared his throat. "Shouldn't you at least verify the account before burning it?" His voice trailed off, uncertain, as Harold's sharp eyes found him. The man shrank back, silent once more. The bystander effect had settled over the room like a heavy fog. Each person knew something wasn't right. Each person waited for someone else to act, and no one did. Anthony felt it all, the glances, the whispers, the cowardly silence. He had lived it before, in boardrooms, in airports, even in grocery store aisles. The faces changed, the words shifted, but the story was always the same. People doubted, people assumed, and when injustice flared up, too often, people turned away. But his father's words steadied him again. Don't give them your anger. Give them your patience. They won't know what to do with it. Anthony clasped his hands loosely in front of him, his breathing even. The world expected him to lash out, to confirm the stereotype Harold had already painted. But Anthony knew the power of waiting. He had built his life on timing, when to buy, when to sell, when to stay silent, and when to speak. A young woman standing near the entrance finally broke the quiet. She had olive skin, long dark hair pulled into a braid, and a phone in her hand. Her name was Maria Gonzalez, though Anthony did not know it yet. She frowned at Harold, then glanced at Anthony. "That wasn't right," she said, her voice low but steady. "You didn't even look at the system. You just burned it." Heads turned toward her. Harold stiffened, his smile faltering for the first time. "Ma'am," Harold snapped, "I don't need a lecture from someone who doesn't understand banking protocols. This man brought in a suspicious check. I handled it." Maria lifted her phone slightly, enough for Harold to see the red recording light. "You handled it, or you humiliated him." Gas stirred the crowd. For the first time, the silence cracked. People began whispering louder, bolder. Someone near the back muttered, "She's right." Another voice added, "That was too much." Anthony did not smile, but his eyes softened slightly. It wasn't relief, exactly, but acknowledgement. He had not been entirely alone. Harold's face darkened. He pointed at Maria. "Turn that off, right now, or I'll have security remove you too." But Maria didn't flinch. "If you're proud of what you did, why would you care if people saw it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Harold's lips pressed into a thin line. His authority, once unchallenged, was starting to fray. Anthony checked the clock again. 2:55. B. The second hand ticked forward, steady, relentless. The tension swelled. Customers shuffled uneasily. Phones came out, screens glowing. More red lights blinking to life. The scene was no longer just a moment in a bank. It was becoming a broadcast. Harold tried to seize back control. "Everyone calm down. I've already contacted security. They'll be here any moment." It was a lie he hadn't called anyone yet, but lies spoken with confidence can feel like truth. For a moment, the customers hesitated, unsure whether to step forward or step back. Anthony still said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was weight. It forced the room to orbit around him without realizing it. The mother in the red coat leaned toward her son and whispered, "Watch carefully. This is history." The boy looked up, eyes wide, though he didn't fully understand. At 2:58 p.m., Anthony finally shifted, just one step forward. Not toward Harold, not toward Maria, but toward the center of the lobby. Every eye followed him. The room fell quiet again. He placed his hands on the counter, his voice calm, low, almost gentle. "You've made your choice. Harold, now it's my turn." Harold scoffed, but there was an edge of unease in it. "Your turn." What could you possibly? Anthony's phone buzzed once more in his pocket. The vibration was faint, but to him, it sounded like a starting bell. He looked at the clock. 2:59. 1 minute left. The crowd held its breath. 3 o'clock was near, and with it, the truth. The second hand on the clock ticked louder in Anthony's mind than it ever could in reality. Each passing moment pulled him deeper into himself, into the places where memory lived. He wasn't just standing in the middle of a bank lobby anymore. He was standing in 1,000 other rooms, from his boyhood to his manhood, where people had decided, before he even spoke, that he did not belong. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, and in that brief silence, he heard his father's voice. Anthony, his father used to say, sitting on their worn porch steps in Birmingham, Alabama. A man can lose a job, a house, even his freedom, but the one thing he cannot afford to lose is his dignity. Don't let them take it from you. Ever. Back then, Anthony hadn't fully understood. He had been just a boy watching his father come home from double shifts at the steel plant, his clothes stained, his hands calloused. Yet his father still carried himself like a man who owned the earth beneath his feet. That memory returned now, like a steady hand on his shoulder. It reminded Anthony why he was still standing tall, even as the ashes of his check clung to Harold Denton's desk. He opened his eyes again, letting them travel across the faces in the lobby. Some were curious, some skeptical, some sympathetic, and some, like Harold's, were hungry to see him break. But Anthony had learned long ago that the world expected black men to lose control. It was the script written for them. Raise your voice, and you confirm their fear. Lower your head, and you feed their superiority. But stand still, breathe slow, and hold silence like a weapon. Then you change the rules of the game. Still, inside him, there was a storm. His chest tightened as anger knocked against his ribs. He thought of the years he had worked, the risks he had taken, the empires he had built, all reduced to ash because one man looked at his skin and saw only fraud. The boy he used to be wanted to shout. The man he had become forced himself to wait. Maria Gonzalez shifted closer, her phone still raised. She caught Anthony's eye for a moment. There was no pity in her gaze, only a fierce kind of solidarity. It steadied him. He gave the faintest nod, as if to say, "I see you. Thank you." At the far side of the lobby, a young teller named Brian Ellis leaned against the wall, arms folded tight. He was barely 23, just a trainee, and fear was written across his face. Yet his eyes darted between Harold and Anthony with unease. He had seen Harold treat customers poorly before refusing loans, dismissing questions, but never something this public, this cruel. Brian's inner voice screamed, "Do something. Say something." But his training, his job, his paycheck all pressed him into silence. He lowered his head, ashamed. Anthony noticed the young man's struggle. He could almost feel the war going on inside him, and it reminded him of his own youth, when he, too, had swallowed words to keep peace. But peace bought at the price of silence was no peace at all. The clock read 2:57. Harold was growing impatient. He drummed his fingers on the desk, looking around as though the attention of the crowd fed him. "You see what I'm dealing with here," he said loudly, his tone dripping with disdain. "A man comes in with a fake check and expects me to believe it. I won't let this bank be a playground for criminals." A few customers murmured their agreement, but more frowned. The tide of opinion was shifting, though Harold couldn't see it. His arrogance blinded him. Anthony let the words wash over him. They no longer hurt. They only confirmed what he already knew. This was bigger than one insult, bigger than one man burning one check. It was about every moment when dignity was treated like disposable paper. And he was determined to make this moment count for more than his own pride. He thought back to his college days, when he had been denied a scholarship interview because someone assumed he didn't belong in the honors program. He remembered the investor meeting in New York, where a waiter had mistaken him for the help and asked him to carry plates. He recalled sitting in a boardroom, watching men half as prepared, half as driven, sail through doors that slammed shut in his face. Every humiliation had been a spark, and every spark had built the fire of his resolve. Now, standing in Riverside First Bank, that fire burned steady, not wild. He would not allow Harold to dictate the story. He would write the ending himself. The crowd waited, restless. The young man with the phone whispered to his friend, "Why isn't he saying anything? Why doesn't he fight back?" Maria answered without lowering her camera, "Because sometimes silence speaks louder than shouting. Watch." At 2:58, Anthony finally moved, slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a handkerchief from his pocket and brushed the ashes from the counter. He handled them with care, as though even the burned fragments of his check deserved respect. Then he placed the folded handkerchief neatly back in his jacket. His every action was measured, intentional. Harold sneered. "What? Are you going to frame that? Keep it as a souvenir of your little scam." Anthony looked at him, calm and steady. His voice, when it came, was low enough to force everyone to lean in. "You've already written your part of the story, Harold, in fire and in arrogance. Now it's my turn to finish it." The crowd stirred. Someone whispered, "What does he mean?" The young man filming raised his phone higher. Anthony's heart pounded, but his face gave nothing away. He thought of his father again, of that porch in Alabama, of the promise he had made to himself as a boy that one day he would stand tall in the face of disrespect, not for revenge, but for justice. The clock ticked. 2:59. 1 minute more, and then the storm would break. The lobby no longer felt like a bank. It felt like a theater stage. Every person cast in a role they had not auditioned for. The air was thick, heavy, as though even oxygen hesitated to move. The clock hands crept toward 3, and in that waiting space, tension rippled through the crowd like static before a storm. Harold Denton mistook the silence for victory. He puffed his chest out, adjusted his tie once more, and leaned over the counter, looking down on Anthony Cole as if he had already won the day. His voice carried across the marble floor. "You can stand there all you want," Harold said, sneering. "But this isn't your place. This bank is built on trust, and I don't trust you." A murmur passed through the room, low and uneasy. It wasn't the murmur of agreement anymore. It was the sound of doubt creeping in. Anthony stood still, his hands folded loosely, his eyes steady. The calm in his posture was beginning to unnerve more than just Harold. Customers who had been content to watch from the sidelines now leaned forward. The weight of the moment pressed against them. Maria Gonzalez, phone raised high, spoke again. Her voice cut clean through the stale air. "You keep talking about trust," she said, "but you didn't even try to check his account. You didn't type a single thing into your system." Her tone wasn't angry. It was firm, measured, the kind of tone that left no room for denial. Several people nodded, whispering to one another. The tide was turning in her direction. Harold flushed red. "Ma'am, I don't need a stranger questioning how I run my branch. You don't understand the risks we deal with fraud, counterfeit, criminal activity. Do you think I'll just take a piece of paper from anyone who walks in here? Anyone Maria shot back? Or just him?" The crowd stirred again, this time louder. The words struck deeper than Harold expected. People began shifting their weight, as though standing on unstable ground. The young man recording muttered, "She got him," and zoomed closer. Anthony didn't move. His patience was deliberate, and it was working. The longer he held still, the more Harold scrambled to fill the silence, and the more the crowd began to see the cracks in the branch manager's authority. At the far corner, Brian Ellis, the young teller, struggled with his conscience. He bit the inside of his cheek, whispering to himself, "Say something. Just say it." His pulse raced. He looked at Anthony, then at Harold, then at Maria. Every second of hesitation felt heavier than the last. Harold, perhaps sensing the shift, raised his voice to the customers. "This man brought a fraudulent check. I took decisive action. If I hadn't, and it turned out to be a scam, every one of you would be thanking me. I am protecting this bank. I am protecting your money." Some customers exchanged glances. They had no words, but their faces betrayed uncertainty. One older gentleman finally spoke, his voice cracking from age, but steady in resolve. "I've been banking here for 30 years, he said. "I've seen checks get questioned, held, sent back, but I've never seen a manager burn one. That wasn't protection. That was humiliation." The words landed hard. People began nodding. A few clapped lightly, hesitant but real. Harold's jaw tightened. His grip on control was slipping. "Enough!" he barked. "Security will be here any second." But no security arrived. The clock ticked to 2:59. Anthony finally shifted his weight, stepping forward into the center of the lobby. Every pair of eyes followed him. His presence pulled the room taut, like a rope straining under pressure. He looked around slowly, meeting the eyes of strangers, one by one, as if silently asking them to see him not just as a man with a check, but as a man with worth. For a brief second, his eyes met Brian's. The young teller froze, then looked down quickly, shame burning his cheeks. But the look had left its mark. Maria lowered her voice, speaking to her phone as much as to herself. "People need to see this. They need to see how dignity looks when it's tested." Harold slammed his hand on the counter. The sound echoed across the lobby. "I've had enough of this circus, sir. Leave my bank before I have you dragged out." Anthony's head tilted slightly, almost a gesture of pity. He glanced at the clock. The minute hand kissed 12. 3 o'clock. The crowd grew silent again, sensing something was about to change. The tension had reached its peak, and even those who had doubted Anthony felt the air shift. It was no longer about one man and a burned check. It was about justice hanging in the balance. Anthony's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He drew in a slow breath. The storm was ready to break. And when it did, nothing in Riverside First Bank would remain the same. The second hand struck 12, and the clock on the wall chimed softly to mark the top of the hour. 3 o'clock. For Anthony Cole. The time carried a weight no one else in that room could grasp. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. Not a random notification, but the signal he had set for himself. He stepped closer to the counter, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. The sound was steady, deliberate, and each step pulled the room deeper into silence. The crowd parted slightly, instinctively giving him space, as if sensing the shift that was about to take place. Harold Denton adjusted his tie, trying to mask the unease crawling up his spine. "What now?" he scoffed. "Going to tell us a story. Going to make excuses." Anthony reached into his jacket, not rushing, not flinching. He pulled out a small leather case. From it, he drew a card, sleek, white, embossed in silver letters. He placed it carefully on the counter where Harold had burned the check. The card read, Anthony Cole, Chairman and CEO, Cole Capital Holdings. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Customers leaned forward, squinting to read the card. Maria Gonzalez zoomed her camera in, her breath catching as she captured the words on her live stream. Harold laughed nervously, a brittle sound. Cute, he said. Anyone can print a business card. Anthony didn't reply. Instead, he slid a tablet from his briefcase. With a few taps, he brought up a secure portal. The bank's own boardroom interface appeared on the screen, glowing in clear blue font. At the top was a shareholder chart. His name stood above all others, 76% controlling ownership, Riverside First Bank. Gaffes echoed through the lobby. The young man filming whispered, "No way," his camera shaking. The older gentleman who had spoken earlier pressed his palm to his forehead, muttering, "Lord have mercy." Harold's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came. He reached for the tablet, but Anthony slid it just out of reach. "This is my bank," Anthony said, his voice calm, carrying to every corner of the lobby. "You burned a check that belonged to me, a check drawn from profits you had no hand in earning, profits I created. You didn't question the system. You questioned me, my skin, my presence, my right to be here." The words struck like hammers. Customers shifted, guilt flickering across their faces. They realized now they had stood by, silent, while a man was humiliated in his own house. Harold stammered, This can't be real. You can't, I can." Anthony interrupted, his tone firm but measured. "And I will. You wrote your judgment in fire. Now hear mine," Maria whispered to her phone. "He owns the bank. He owns it. The manager just burned his boss's check." The comments on her stream exploded. Hearts, angry faces, and words like justice and accountability scrolled faster than she could read. Anthony set the tablet upright so everyone could see the numbers. "I am the majority shareholder. The board answers to me, and starting today, this institution will answer for its failures." The silence in the lobby was no longer passive. It was reverent, charged. People were no longer looking at Harold. They were looking at Anthony. Harold's knees wobbled. His authority, once inflated by arrogance, collapsed under the weight of truth. You should have told me who you were," he managed, desperate. Anthony shook his head slowly. "It shouldn't matter who I am. No customer should have to prove their worth before they are treated with respect." The older gentleman clapped once, loud, breaking the tension. Others followed, hesitant at first, then bolder. Applause rippled through the lobby, not just for the revelation, but for the truth behind his words. Harold slammed his fist on the counter, desperate to reclaim control. "This is a stunt. You think owning shares gives you the right to embarrass me?" Anthony looked at him with quiet pity. "No. Harold, you embarrassed yourself." The young teller, Brian Ellis, felt his heart leap. In that moment, he saw more clearly than ever that silence had protected the wrong side. He wished he had spoken sooner, but he knew this wasn't the end. The reckoning had only begun. Anthony glanced once more at the clock. 3:05. The waiting was over. The tide had turned. He turned back to Harold, his voice low but commanding. "You want to talk about trust? Trust is built on truth, and the truth is simple. You failed. Not just me, but everyone watching. And now, you will answer for it." The crowd leaned closer, hungry for what would come next. Maria's live stream counter ticked upward hundreds, then thousands of viewers pouring in. Anthony's stillness was gone now. He was no longer waiting. He was moving forward. The storm had broken, and Harold Denton stood directly in its path. The applause faded into a heavy silence, but the energy in the room had changed completely. For the first time since Anthony Cole had walked into Riverside First Bank, the weight of power rested not on Harold Denton's shoulders, but squarely on Anthony's. The crowd no longer looked at Harold as the authority. They looked at him like a man standing trial. Anthony placed both hands gently on the counter, his movements deliberate. "This bank," he began, his voice deep and steady, "has rules. Rules to protect customers, rules to protect employees, and rules to protect dignity." He tapped the tablet, scrolling through documents only someone with full access could display. Section 7B of our internal charter, grounds for termination, discriminatory treatment of any customer based on race, gender, or perceived status. It is written here in the very laws of the institution you claim to serve. Harold blinked rapidly, sweat gathering at his brow. "You're twisting this. I made a judgment call." "A judgment call," Anthony repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No. You made an assumption. You assumed I was a fraud. You assumed my check was worthless. And you chose to humiliate me publicly instead of verifying facts. That is not judgment, Harold. That is prejudice dressed as authority." Gasps came from the crowd. The older gentleman who had spoken earlier muttered, "He's right. He's dead right." Maria Gonzalez tilted her phone closer to Anthony, her live stream capturing every word. Comments scrolled across her screen. "Preach. This is history. Don't stop." Anthony's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. His calmness forced everyone to lean in, to hang on every syllable. "In my years of business, I've seen arrogance, I've seen greed. But what you did, Harold, is more dangerous. You burned more than a piece of paper. You burned trust. You burned dignity. And you thought no one would hold you accountable." Harold's voice cracked as he tried to push back. "I was protecting this bank." Anthony shook his head slowly. "No, Harold, you were protecting your ego. You decided who looked like they belonged, and you decided I did not. Tell me, what is a bank without trust, without fairness, without dignity?" No one answered. The customers watched, some nodding, some ashamed. Even Brian Ellis, the young teller, felt the truth sting him like cold air. Anthony turned slightly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "And you, every one of you, witnessed this. You saw what was done. Some of you laughed. Some of you said nothing. That silence, too, is dangerous, because silence is what allows arrogance to survive." Murmurs rippled through the room. A woman near the back lowered her head, clutching her purse tighter. The teenager in the hoodie whispered to his friend, "He's talking about us." Anthony's gaze returned to Harold. "But here's the difference. Unlike you, I believe in accountability. Unlike you, I believe in choices. And today, Harold Denton, I am giving you one." The crowd stilled again. Maria whispered into her phone, "Here it comes." Anthony pulled a folder from his briefcase. Inside was a single sheet of paper, already prepared, already signed. He placed it on the counter. "Option 1, Anthony said, his tone clear. "You resign your position as branch manager. Effective immediately, you issue a public apology, not only to me, but to every customer who has suffered under your bias. Your salary is reduced by 40%. your bonus revoked, and you will complete 250 hours of community service in neighborhoods you have ignored. You will also repay $50,000 to the bank for the damages caused by your actions." The crowd reacted with audible gasps. Harold's jaw fell open. "That's outrageous." "Option 2, Anthony continued, cutting him off. "You are terminated for cause. Effective this moment, you will lose your severance, your pension contributions, and your benefits. And this file," he tapped the folder, "will be forwarded to federal regulators for review. Which path you choose will determine whether this ends as discipline or as disgrace." The weight of his words settled like a stone in the room. The crowd didn't breathe. Phones stayed raised, recording every second. Harold's face twisted. You can't humiliate me like this in front of everyone." Anthony's tone sharpened just slightly, enough to cut. "Humiliation. What you feel now is accountability. What you gave me was humiliation." The young man recording whispered, "Damn," under his breath, earning a sharp elbow from his friend. Harold's breathing grew ragged. He glanced around, looking for support, but the faces that met his gaze were hard, unyielding. No ally remained. Brian Ellis felt his pulse quicken. He wanted to speak. He wanted to stand on the side of truth. His lips parted, but fear kept the words inside. Still, Anthony's eyes found him again, just for a second. The look said, "Your time will come." Maria, filming steady, murmured into her stream, "This is justice unfolding. He's giving the man a choice, redemption or ruin." Anthony leaned forward slightly, his voice low, meant only for Harold but loud enough for all to hear. "I built this bank on the belief that dignity has no price tag. You will learn that now. Harold, choose carefully." The clock ticked. The second hand moved with relentless patience. Harold swallowed hard, his lips trembling. His arrogance had withered, his authority stripped bare. For the first time, the man looked small, diminished in the eyes of those he once commanded. The crowd waited, silent but expectant, as if the entire weight of justice rested on what Harold Denton would say next. For a moment, the bank lobby seemed frozen in time. The clock ticked on, but no one moved. All eyes remained locked on Harold Denton, the man who had been so quick to light a flame under another's dignity. His face glistened with sweat, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The weight of Anthony Cole's ultimatum pressed down on him, heavier than any balance sheet he had ever managed. But the silence didn't last. A voice rose from the back, thin but unwavering. "He's right." Everyone turned. It was the older gentleman who had spoken earlier, his cane tapping the tile as he stepped forward. His eyes, watery but fierce, locked on Harold. "I've banked here for 40 years. I've watched good people turned away, not because of paperwork, but because of pride, because folks like you decided they didn't belong. Enough is enough," the crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement. A woman in a business suit, holding her toddler's hand, lifted her chin. "Last year, I brought in a cashier's check from selling my car. You told me it looked suspicious. You made me feel like a criminal in front of my child. I never forgot that." Her words cracked the dam. Another customer, a man in a delivery uniform, spoke up. "You flagged my deposit twice. Harold said it didn't match my income profile. You embarrassed me in front of the whole line. I walked out that day and swore I'd never come back. But the mortgage locked me here." The stories poured forth like water, long trapped behind stone. Maria Gonzalez angled her phone toward the crowd, whispering to her viewers. Listen to this. They're finding their voices. Her chat exploded with messages. This isn't just one man. It's a pattern. Expose him. Systemic. Harold raised his hands, panicked. That's not true. You're twisting everything I was doing. My job. Anthony didn't speak. He let the voices of the customers rise, his silence a deliberate choice. Leadership, he knew, wasn't always about being the loudest. It was about knowing when to listen. Brian Ellis, the young teller, swallowed hard. His chest ached with guilt. He stepped forward, his voice shaking. Mr. Cole, I saw things. I heard them. He faltered, glancing at Harold, then back at Anthony. He told us to profile certain clients. He said, watch the ones who don't look the part. The lobby erupted. Shock rippled through the room. Customers gasped, a few shouting angrily. One woman muttered, I knew it. Anthony's eyes softened as he looked at Brian. Thank you, he said simply, his tone carrying no judgment, only acknowledgement. The truth takes courage. Harold lunged forward, pointing at Brian. You ungrateful kid. After all I've done for you enough, Anthony said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The single word silenced the room. He turned back to the customers. This is what happens when arrogance hides behind authority, when silence protects the wrong voices. But today, the silence is broken. Today, truth stands taller than pride. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Even the teenager in the hoodie clapped, his eyes wide as if he was witnessing something larger than himself. Anthony's phone buzzed again in his pocket. He didn't check it, but he knew what it meant. His team had prepared for this moment. Every live stream, every recording, was now being mirrored to the bank's corporate server. The evidence was secure. No one could bury it. Harold sagged against the counter, his defiance crumbling. You can't do this. Not in front of everyone. Anthony leaned in, his voice calm but resolute. In front of everyone is exactly where this must happen, because injustice thrives in shadows. Today, we choose the light. The words struck deep. Customers nodded. Maria's chat exploded with the phrase, choose the light. Anthony straightened, his presence filling the space. This is bigger than a burned check. This is about dignity. Every person here deserves to walk into a bank, or a store, or an office, and be seen, not judged, respected, not dismissed. And if this bank cannot uphold that truth, then it does not deserve to exist. The applause was thunderous now, not scattered, but unified. A sound that shook the marble walls. Harold's lips trembled. He looked around, searching desperately for even a single ally. But every eye, every camera, every heart was turned against him. He was no longer the gatekeeper. He was the example. Brian Ellis stepped closer to Anthony, his voice steadier this time. Mr. Cole, if you want, I'll testify. I'll back it up. People need to know the truth. Anthony nodded once, his expression firm but encouraging. Good, because truth is not just spoken, it's lived. The clock struck 3:20. What had begun as a humiliating spectacle was now a public reckoning. And Anthony Cole knew this was only the beginning. Harold Denton stood as if the floor had betrayed him, his polished shoes, once planted with false confidence, now shifted nervously against the marble tiles. The crowd's story still echoed in the air, each testimony a nail driven deeper into the coffin of his authority. His tie hung loose, his hands trembled. For the first time in years, he was not the man behind the counter giving orders. He was the man cornered by truth. Anthony Cole did not press further. He knew silence could be louder than condemnation. He folded his arms across his chest and waited, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. It was Harold's turn to wrestle with the reality he had so long ignored. The clock ticked toward 3:30. The air felt heavier with every second. Customers shifted uneasily, their loyalty hanging in balance, not to Harold but to the institution itself. Finally, Harold spoke, his voice cracking. "You don't understand," he said, staring at the floor. "I built this branch. I kept the numbers clean, the regulators off our backs. I did what had to be done." Anthony tilted his head slightly. "What had to be done?" He repeated. "Tell me, Harold, did humiliating customers strengthen this branch? Did burning a check make regulators proud?" Harold's jaw clenched. I was protecting standards. People take advantage. I had to weed them out." A man in the crowd scoffed. "You weren't protecting us. You were protecting yourself." Harold shot him a glare but quickly looked away, defeated. His eyes darted back to Anthony. "You don't know what it's like. The pressure, the expectations." He faltered, then swallowed hard. "I'm not the villain here." Anthony stepped closer, his voice firm but not cruel. "You're not a villain, Harold. You're a man who made choices rooted in fear and arrogance. And now you face a choice again. But this time, the weight isn't just on your shoulders. It's on everyone who trusted you. What you decide today will tell this room, this city, who you truly are." The words lingered. Harold's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. For the first time, the mask of arrogance cracked enough to show the man beneath tired, bitter, yet terrified of losing everything. Maria Gonzalez whispered to her phone, "He's breaking. You can see it." Thousands of comments filled her stream. "Make him resign. This is history. Redemption or ruin." Anthony extended a hand toward the resignation document lying on the counter. "The pen is here. The choice is yours." Harold's fingers twitched. He stared at the paper as though it were an execution order. Slowly, shakily, he picked it up. He held the pen above the line, his lips trembling. Then he froze. The young teller, Brian Ellis, stepped forward. "Mr. Denton," he said softly, "it doesn't have to end this way. You can take responsibility. You can make it right. But if you keep fighting, you'll only prove everything they've said about you." Harold's hand shook harder. His eyes darted between Brian and Anthony. For a moment, he seemed on the edge of signing, but arrogance dies slowly. He slammed the pen down, his voice rising in desperation. "This is a trap. You want me gone because I didn't bow down. You think you're better than me because you've got money, because you sit in some office making calls. You don't know the dirt I've crawled through to get here." The room stirred. Customers shifted uncomfortably. Maria's chat exploded with disbelief. Anthony's tone remained steady. "You're right. I don't know the dirt you've crawled through. But I do know this: the dirt doesn't excuse the fire. Struggle does not give you the right to scorch others." Harold's eyes welled with tears, though he blinked them back angrily. He turned to the crowd. "You all want me gone. Fine. But when I'm gone, don't think this place will change. Banks don't change. People don't change. You'll be right back where you started, treated like you don't matter." For a beat, silence followed his words. His attempt at a final defense dangled in the air. Then the older gentleman with the cane spoke again, his voice rough but sure. "Maybe you're right. Maybe banks don't change on their own. But people do. And today we've seen what change looks like. We've seen a man burned, and still he stands tall. That's more than you've ever done for us." The crowd murmured their agreement. The tide had turned too far to reverse. Anthony drew a deep breath. He had hoped Harold would choose dignity, but hope alone could not rewrite truth. "Then you leave me no choice," Anthony said quietly, but the words carried across the room. "Effective immediately. Harold Denton, you are terminated for cause. Security will escort you out." Gas filled the lobby. Maria's stream lit up with, "It happened. Justice. He's out." Harold's face drained of color. He staggered back, his hand gripping the counter for support. His voice cracked into a plea. "Please, don't do this. I have a family." I have Anthony's expression softened, but his resolve did not waver. And every person you dismissed, every life you belittled, they had families too. They had worth. You chose not to see it, but today you will face it. Two uniformed security officers approached. Harold tried to push past, but his strength had left him. As they guided him toward the door, his voice broke into a mix of curses and sobs. The crowd did not cheer. They did not mock. They simply watched, some in relief, some in sorrow, as a man who had once ruled this branch was escorted out under the same rules he had twisted against others. When the doors closed behind him, Anthony turned back to the room. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Justice is not the end. It's the beginning. What we do next will define whether today is a moment or a movement. The crowd listened, their eyes fixed on him, knowing they were part of something far greater than one man's downfall. The lobby felt strangely lighter once the doors closed behind Harold Denton. The man who had carried himself like a gatekeeper of wealth and dignity was gone, and with him, the tension that had poisoned the room. But the silence that followed wasn't relief alone. It was uncertainty. What now? Anthony Cole remained standing at the counter, the resignation form still resting where Harold had refused to sign. He didn't move immediately. He let the room breathe. He let people feel the shift. Then, slowly, he turned toward the crowd. His eyes swept across their faces. The mother with her toddler, the delivery man with his cap tucked in his hands, the teenager in the hoodie, the older gentleman leaning on his cane, and Brian Ellis, the young teller who still stood awkwardly, torn between shame and resolve. "This isn't finished," Anthony said, his voice calm but firm. "Removing one man doesn't erase years of distrust. It doesn't erase what each of you experienced in this place. That trust has to be rebuilt, and it starts today." The mother raised her hand slightly, almost as if she were in church. "How do we believe that? Mr. Cole, we've been let down so many times." Anthony nodded. "By proof, not by words." He lifted the tablet again and tapped quickly through the interface. The screen filled with documents audits, customer satisfaction charts, community investment plans. Starting tonight, I'm ordering a full review of 5 years of customer complaints. Every file will be reopened. Every person ignored will get a call not from a branch manager, but from me or a member of the executive board. If this bank has wronged you, we will own it, and we will make it right. The delivery man crossed his arms. Skeptical. "That sounds good. But what about folks like us who ain't got lawyers or money to fight a call? Don't fix that." Anthony met his eyes. "That's why we're also creating something new. A dignity review board, made of employees and customers. Yes, customers who will oversee complaints in real time. No more closed doors. No more buried files." Gas fluttered through the room. Maria Gonzalez whispered into her phone. "He's tearing down the walls from inside." Her live stream chat filled with, "This is groundbreaking." "He's holding himself accountable, too." Brian Ellis stepped closer, his voice low but audible. "Mr. Cole, if you mean that, I want to be part of it. I've stayed quiet too long. I want to do it right this time." Anthony looked at him with a soft but steady gaze. "Then you'll have that chance, because silence has no place in this institution anymore." The older gentleman tapped his cane, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Words are fine, son. But you're going to stick around when the cameras leave. Too many men come in promising change, then vanish once the fire dies down." Anthony inhaled slowly. The words struck deep, because he knew they weren't wrong. "You're right. Change doesn't live in speeches. It lives in habits. It lives in policies. And it lives in people willing to stay when it's uncomfortable. I didn't come here to escape the fire. I came here to start it to burn away what no longer belongs." The teenager in the hoodie raised his phone high, capturing Anthony's face. "Say that again. Man, that's fire." Anthony almost smiled. "I said change doesn't run from the fire. It uses it to clear the way for new growth." Applause broke out again. Smaller, but steadier. The kind that builds from conviction rather than spectacle. Anthony took a step back from the counter. "But this isn't about me. It's about all of you. So I'm asking, what do you need to see from this bank to believe again?" Voices rose. The mother spoke of transparency. The delivery man demanded fair treatment, regardless of appearance. The woman near the back wanted faster dispute resolution. Each spoke with urgency, some with anger, all with wounds that had lingered too long. Maria whispered into her stream, "They're rewriting the rules right here in the lobby." Anthony listened, not interrupting, taking notes on his tablet as if each voice carried the weight of a board directive. He nodded, occasionally asking a clarifying question, but mostly he let the people speak. Finally, when the voices quieted, he said, "You've been ignored long enough. Starting today, this lobby is not just a place for transactions. It's a place for accountability. Once a month, I'll be here, not in a skyscraper office, but here, listening, and anyone who wants to speak will be heard." The crowd stirred, disbelief softening into cautious hope. Brian Ellis looked down, ashamed, then back up at Anthony. "I should have spoken sooner. I let people get hurt because I was scared." How do I live with that? Anthony's expression softened. By not repeating it. We can't change yesterday, but we can decide whether tomorrow looks the same. Tears welled in Brian's eyes, but he nodded. The mother pulled her toddler closer and whispered, "Maybe it's different this time." The older gentleman leaned on his cane and muttered, "We'll see." But his tone carried less skepticism than before. Anthony closed the tablet. "This isn't about forgiveness. It's about responsibility. And that responsibility is mine, because this bank carries my name in more ways than one. But I can't do it alone. I need you to hold me accountable. Can you do that?" The delivery man spoke first. "If you mean it, yeah. We'll hold you to it." Others nodded, murmuring agreement. Anthony let the moment settle. Then he said quietly, "Good, because the cost of assumptions nearly burned this institution to the ground today. But the ashes can still feed something new if we choose to plant." The crowd didn't cheer loudly this time. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was the silence of people beginning to believe. By the time the clock edged toward 4 o'clock, The lobby of Riverside First Bank no longer felt like a bank. It felt like a courtroom, a town hall, and a sanctuary all at once. Strangers had told their truths. A manager had been stripped of his power, and Anthony Cole now stood at the center, holding both the weight of justice and the promise of change. Anthony drew a long breath, as if pulling strength from the very air. He lifted the charred remains of his burned check, still lying in the shallow metal tray behind the counter. The edges were black, brittle, crumbling at his touch. He raised it high for everyone to see. "This," he said, his voice deep but unshaken, "is more than paper." It was value. It was trust. It was a symbol of years of work. And with one careless act, it was turned to ash. The crowd stilled, eyes fixed on the burned check. Anthony continued, "But this ash, this cost of assumptions, will not be hidden. It will not be swept away." He placed the remains gently into a clear glass jar that one of the tellers brought him with trembling hands. He sealed the lid and set it on the counter like a relic. "From today forward, this jar will sit in the lobby of every Riverside First Bank, so that every customer, every teller, every manager will see the cost of arrogance before they make the mistake of assuming who belongs and who does not." Gasps spread across the room. Maria Gonzalez whispered into her live stream, "He's making it a memorial. He's turning humiliation into testimony." The comments poured in. "That's powerful. Symbol of dignity. Every bank should do this." The older gentleman tapped his cane against the tile. "Never thought I'd live to see the day a bank carried a conscience." Anthony turned toward him. "Conscience is not enough. We need accountability. This jar will not sit alone. Beside it, there will be a pledge signed by every employee, a pledge to treat every customer with dignity, no matter what they look like, no matter what they carry in their hands. And if that pledge is broken, it won't take a scandal for justice to come. It will happen here, immediately." Brian Ellis, still standing near the counter, swallowed hard. His voice carried both fear and determination. "I'll sign it first. I want to be the first name on that paper." Anthony looked at him, and for the first time, a small smile broke across his face. "Then you will be?" The mother with her toddler wiped a tear from her cheek. "My daughter's going to grow up seeing that jar. She'll know that respect isn't optional, it's required." The delivery man nodded, his voice rough but steady. "That's the kind of bank I can walk into without bracing myself." Anthony's gaze softened as he scanned the room. "This isn't just a memorial, it's a mirror. Because assumptions don't burn, only checks they burn people. And if we don't confront them, we carry the ashes into every corner of our lives." He paused, his voice lowering. "Some of you here know what it's like to walk into a room and be measured by appearance before a word leaves your mouth. Some of you know what it feels like to be dismissed before being heard. That wound stays. It follows you. I know it, because I've lived it." The silence that followed was heavy. Customers shifted, some nodding slowly, others bowing their heads. Maria whispered into her phone, her voice thick with emotion. "He's not just talking about banking anymore. He's talking about all of us." Anthony stepped closer to the crowd, his tone almost intimate. "But here's the truth. Dignity doesn't expire. It doesn't shrink when challenged. It doesn't burn when lit. Dignity survives if we choose to protect it. And today, we choose." The teenager in the hoodie raised his phone higher, whispering, "Man, this is history." Anthony placed his hand on the jar once more. "This is not a reminder of loss. It is a promise never again." Applause broke out strong, united, carrying the weight of conviction. Anthony let it swell, then raised his hand gently to quiet the room. There's one more thing. Harold Denton was not the only one who failed. Systems failed. Oversight failed. And I failed too because I trusted silence instead of demanding proof sooner. That ends now. Accountability starts at the top, and the top is me. The crowd absorbed his words. Some faces softened, others held steady, testing whether they believed him. Brian Ellis spoke again, his voice steadier than before. If you're willing to admit that, Mr. Cole, then maybe this place has a chance. Anthony nodded. Not maybe. Brian, it has to, because dignity is not negotiable. The mother pulled her daughter into her arms, whispering into the child's hair, Remember this day, baby, remember it. Maria's stream counter surged, tens of thousands of viewers watching live, hearts and comments flying faster than the eye could follow. She steadied her phone, her voice hushed but strong. The cost of assumptions is written in ash, and he's making sure we all see it. Anthony Cole looked around the lobby one last time before stepping back from the counter. His voice carried both the weight of sorrow and the spark of hope. Justice brought us here. Now dignity will lead us forward. The crowd rose, not just to leave, but to stand together for the first time, not as customers in line, but as a community in witness. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the tall glass windows of Riverside First Bank. The jar with the charred check now sat prominently on the counter, its blackened fragments a silent sentinel. Word had spread faster than wildfire. By dawn, Maria Gonzalez's live stream had been shared across platforms, replayed on local news, and clipped into sound bites on national broadcasts. The phrase, the cost of assumptions, trended across social media. Anthony Cole arrived just after 8, not in a chauffeured car, but on foot. He carried no entourage, only his leather briefcase and the weight of a new day. A crowd had already gathered outside, some holding signs of support, others holding their phones aloft, eager to capture history as it unfolded. Inside, the mood was electric. Customers leaned against counters, whispering. Employees, still adjusting to the whirlwind, glanced anxiously toward the doors. And there, waiting in the lobby, stood Brian Ellis, his shirt pressed neatly, his posture straighter than usual. Mr. Cole, Brian said as Anthony entered, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. I wanted to be here first. I meant what I said yesterday. I'll sign the pledge before anyone else. Anthony nodded, his gaze steady. Good. Then you'll be the one to lead others. A table had been set up near the jar, with a large parchment titled The Dignity Pledge. Beneath the title, bold words read, I will treat every person with fairness, respect, and humanity, regardless of appearance, status, or background. Brian picked up the pen. His hand trembled, but he signed. The scratch of ink across paper sounded louder than the murmurs of the room. Applause broke out. Customers clapped, employees followed, and Maria, back with her phone streaming, whispered, The first name is written. History begins here, one by one. Employees stepped forward, some eager, some hesitant. A young teller signed quickly, her cheeks flushed. A senior loan officer paused, then bent over the page, her expression conflicted but determined. The pledge grew with signatures, each one a small act of accountability. The mother who had spoken the day before approached, toddler in her arms. Can customers sign too? She asked. Anthony smiled softly. Yes. Because this isn't just for employees. It's for everyone who walks through these doors." She shifted her daughter onto her hip and signed her own name. Then she guided her daughter's small hand, helping her scrawl a wobbly line. The crowd chuckled warmly, but the symbolism hit deep. The delivery man followed, slapping the pen against the table before writing his name in large, bold letters. "Put me on it. I want to see this through." Even the older gentleman shuffled forward, his cane tapping with each step. He pressed the pen to the page with shaking hands. "If I can still write, I'll put my name to it." His signature, though crooked, drew a ripple of applause. Maria narrated into her stream. "This isn't just a pledge. It's a movement. People are choosing to belong to something bigger than themselves." By mid-morning, the parchment was nearly full. A second sheet was placed beside it, then a third. Anthony stood watching, not with pride, but with a steady awareness of the responsibility deepening on his shoulders. He knew symbolism alone wouldn't repair decades of mistrust, but it was a start. Just then, a reporter from a local news station stepped inside. Microphone in hand, "Mr. Cole," she called, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Yesterday you fired a branch manager in front of the world. Today you're rewriting policy in public. What do you say to critics who call this a publicity stunt?" The room quieted. All eyes turned toward Anthony. He straightened, his voice calm. "Publicity fades, dignity lasts. If anyone calls this a stunt, let them. The people in this room know it isn't theater, it's their lives. They deserve more than apologies. They deserve action." The crowd erupted in cheers. Maria's live stream lit up with fire emojis and hearts. The reporter pressed further. "And what about the board of directors? How do they feel about you handling this so openly?" Anthony's gaze sharpened, but his tone stayed measured. "The board answers to the majority shareholder. That's me. And I answer to the people who trust this bank with their livelihoods. Transparency is not optional. It's mandatory." Brian Ellis's chest swelled with pride at those words. For the first time in years, he felt proud to wear his teller's badge. By noon, other branches had begun calling in. Photos circulated online of employees setting jars on their counters, filled with ash from burned paper, shredded documents, old forms, even symbolic checks. Hashtag spread. The cost of assumptions. Anthony's phone buzzed with messages from fellow CEOs, activists, and even political leaders. Some congratulated him, others warned him. One text from a rival banker read, "You're setting a precedent that will haunt the entire industry." Anthony looked at the message for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Good, he thought. It's time the industry was haunted. As afternoon light streamed across the marble floor, Anthony addressed the lobby once more. This jar will remain here. This pledge will grow. But most of all, this bank will be measured not by the money it holds, but by the dignity it gives. That is the cost of assumptions and the value of respect. The crowd responded not with thunderous applause this time, but with something quieter, deeper, a collective nodding, a sense of belonging, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. By the end of that week, the walls of Riverside First Bank bore the weight of change. The glass jar of ash was no longer just an object on a counter. It had become a magnet, pulling in visitors who had never stepped foot in the branch before. Teachers brought their students to see it, calling it a living lesson. Community leaders held small circles of conversation beneath its shadow. And every morning, Anthony Cole returned to find new signatures on the parchment of the Dignity Pledge. But Anthony knew symbols alone couldn't hold the future. They needed structure. They needed policy. They needed proof. He called for a town hall meeting on Saturday afternoon, held in the lobby itself. Chairs were arranged in rows, microphones were set up, and cameras from 3 local news stations rolled. Customers and employees alike filled the space until people stood shoulder to shoulder against the marble walls. Anthony stepped to the front, his posture straight, his eyes steady. "You've all given me your trust these past few days. Now it's time I show you how we'll honor it." He tapped his tablet, projecting a series of slides onto a screen behind him. "First," he said, "effective immediately, Riverside First Bank is launching the Bias Interruption Program. Every employee, from teller to executive, will receive 40 hours of training not just in compliance, but in real-world intervention. If a colleague witnesses bias, they will have the authority to stop it in its tracks. No more excuses, no more silence." A murmur swept through the crowd. Brian Ellis straightened in his chair, nodding with conviction. "Second," Anthony continued, "we are opening our data. Every quarter, the bank will publish reports showing approval rates, complaint resolutions, and customer satisfaction scores broken down by race, gender, and income level. If disparities appear, we won't bury them. We'll fix them." The delivery man seated near the aisle muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Finally, some honesty." Anthony pressed on. "Third, we are investing $2 million into local minority-owned businesses and nonprofits this year. Not as charity, but as recognition, because communities that banks ignored have been carrying us all along." Applause broke out. Maria Gonzalez, standing near the back with her live stream running, whispered, "They're not just hearing promises. They're hearing commitments backed by numbers." Anthony's tone softened as he turned away from the slides. But policies and pledges aren't enough. They must be lived. And that means we need you customers, employees, neighbors to keep us accountable. This bank isn't just mine. It's yours. Hold me to that. The crowd stood in ovation. The older gentleman with the cane raised his voice over the applause. "If you keep this fire burning, son, I'll believe, and maybe my grandchildren won't have to fight the same battles I did." Anthony's eyes softened, and he bowed his head slightly. "That is the hope, sir. That is the work." After the meeting, people lingered. The mother with her toddler spoke quietly to Anthony. "You know, my daughter doesn't really understand all this yet, but one day she will. She'll remember being here, and she'll know that dignity has a place in the world." Anthony bent down so his eyes met the little girl's. "And when she does, it will be because her mother showed her what standing tall looks like." The child smiled shyly, clutching her mother's sleeve. Brian Ellis approached next, his expression torn between pride and vulnerability. "Mr. Cole, I've been thinking. All those times I stayed quiet, I can't undo them. But I want to do more than just sign pledges. I want to help lead this change." Anthony studied him for a moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Leadership isn't about perfection, Brian. It's about courage when it counts. You showed courage when you spoke yesterday. That's the kind of voice we need. Starting Monday, you'll join the Dignity Review Board." Brian's eyes widened, his throat tight with emotion. I won't let you down." "I know," Anthony replied simply. That night, as the crowd dispersed and the news vans pulled away, Anthony remained in the lobby alone. The jar of ash caught the glow of the overhead lights. He sat quietly in one of the chairs, exhaustion finally settling over him. He thought of Harold Denton not with anger, but with a heavy sorrow. Harold had made choices, and those choices had burned him. Yet Anthony couldn't help but wonder if Harold, too, had once been a man who only wanted to prove himself. How many others in the system had been hardened by fear, by pressure, by arrogance disguised as survival? Anthony whispered into the empty room. May this fire teach us, not consume us. The next morning, news outlets across the country carried the story. The headlines varied. Bank CEO confronts racism at branch, ashes of assumptions, become symbol of reform. Community voices spark financial revolution. Talk shows debated whether Anthony's actions would ripple into the wider industry. Politicians issued cautious statements. Rival bankers scoffed publicly, yet scrambled privately. But what mattered most wasn't in the headlines. It was in the people who walked through the bank's doors. Customers who once avoided the place returned, curious. Employees spoke more carefully, more respectfully, and the jar remained, drawing eyes, sparking conversations, refusing to let anyone forget. A week later, Anthony stood outside the branch as the sun set. The mother and her daughter passed by, waving. The delivery man tipped his cap. Brian Ellis walked out beside him, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Maria Gonzalez paused with her phone, capturing one last shot for her viewers. Anthony looked up at the glowing sign above the bank and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Not because the work was done, it was only beginning, but because for the first time in years, he felt the institution he had built was beginning to reflect the values he had always believed in: dignity, accountability, justice. The fire of assumptions had left its ashes, but from those ashes, something stronger had begun to rise. The story of Anthony Cole reminds us of a truth many of us have lived through. Dignity is not given. It is insisted upon. For older generations, who have witnessed decades of change, some good, some painful, this story speaks directly to the heart. It shows that injustice may humiliate us in public, but how we respond defines our legacy. When Anthony chose not to lash out in anger, but instead to reveal his true power with calm conviction, he taught us something vital, that quiet strength often speaks louder than rage. He turned an act of disrespect into a movement for fairness, not just for himself, but for an entire community. The lesson for our own lives is simple yet profound. When faced with prejudice or mistreatment, we can transform that moment into something larger than ourselves. We can hold others accountable while still offering a path to redemption. And above all, we must remember our worth is never decided by someone else's assumptions. For those of us who have walked long roads, Anthony's story is a reminder that it's never too late to demand justice, to shape change, and to leave behind a legacy of dignity. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like these only come alive because of people like you who care about justice, dignity, and respect. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling powerful stories that matter, and together, we can make sure these lessons reach the world.